Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Majlis Markets. As always, I am your host, Hassan Jivraj. I'm really happy to be doing my fourth episode on YouTube, and I'm really happy to be talking to my next guest on this episode. But before we get into the episode, please do remember to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast, and vodcast, I should rather say. It'll be available on YouTube shortly and all audio platforms. But now we will begin our fourth episode on YouTube, and episode 62, with none other than Reza Jaufeerally. Reza, welcome back to Majlis Markets, part two.
Assalamu alaikum, Hassan. Thank you so much for
Alaikum
having
salam.
me on the podcast. Greetings to you and to all your listeners.
And the viewers as well, we should say as well, people who are watching on
Very
YouTube.
much viewers.
Yes, it's Reza, I was just thinking before we started recording. I was looking when we actually last spoke, and it was back in July last year, and it was a fantastic episode. I think it's one of the most listened to episodes on Majlis Markets, and we really went deep on like some of the issues in Islamic finance, and I really felt like we touched a lot of ground, and we made up a lot of ground in that episode. And a lot of people did message me saying they really enjoyed that episode. But now, obviously, we're doing this in video format, so people can see our expressions and see your handsome face, mashallah. But Reza, what have you been up to since the last podcast?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot happening both on a professional and on a personal basis. And as you know, in Islam, there's no separation between your professional and your personal life. So to start with, my dad unfortunately passed away, but we pray to Allah that he's in a better place. And what happens is that when a parent passes away, it forces you to reconsider the meaning of your life, also your relationship to your loved ones, and what really matters in life. And this has impacted me a lot personally, in that what I've realized is that whatever time I have in this dunya, I have to use it in the path of what the Creator has advocated for us. And I look at every day like a blessing. I also have been forced to reconsider my own relationship with my children, because one day I won't be here anymore. So I look at every day as an opportunity to try to do well around me. Also, because everyone is throughout the Muslim world and beyond, facing challenges in his own life, some small, some larger. But I tend to think that whatever is in our path is a way to, a means to better ourselves. It is a test. But ultimately, there's this adage, every cloud has got a silver lining. But I think that it's going back to the idea of if you'll excuse me, the glass being half full and half empty. I think everyone should start from the idea that you have a glass. So that's what I've realized, and I'm essentially changing my life, including my professional life, to do the most good around me for the time that I'm still in this.
First of all, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you.
And secondly, so there's not one day where I don't think of my father. He was a man who had all the virtues of my paternal grandmother, who in my mind was a saintly figure.
First of all, just to wish you and your family condolences on your father's passing. I hope it was easy on you and your family. And yeah, my duas and prayers are with you and your family. I know how much you value family. So our prayers and thoughts are with you and your family in this. And what about in your professional life? What have you been up to since then?
So yes, so I mentioned this because this has clearly changed how I viewed my professional life. You know, because last time we didn't really talk about it. I have a company in Luxembourg which is part of the space sector, which is called No Hunger. The name No Hunger is a portmanteau of United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 1 and United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 1 is no poverty and number 2 is zero hunger. Logically, however materially rich you are, if you're not eating correctly, you're poor. And however materially poor you are, if every day you have access to dignified food, you're doing okay. So, which is why they have to come together. And also for Islamic ethics, according to our religion, we abhor famine. Famine is something terrible, and it needs to be fought with every means necessary. And also what you need to bear in mind is that famine necessarily leads to war, which leads to annihilation. So we need to fight. And the mission of No Hunger is to address the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through the use of space technologies financed through the impact, ethical, and Islamic capital markets. So it is about UN SDGs, especially climate, because climate is the source of all crises. Space technologies, because the very best of human technologies have all got a connection to space. Money, large amounts of money that is right now underutilized and which can be channeled towards, for lack of a better term, saving the world. I will just use two figures. According to the United Nations, by 2050, there would be 800 million climate refugees. According to Zurich Insurance Group, by 2050, there would be 1.2 billion climate refugees. There is an urgent need to channel our energy, our intellect, and our financial resources to addressing climate crisis. It is not optional, it is existential. And also, strictly speaking, it makes a lot of commercial sense. I will just point back to what just happened in Switzerland, which is very, very concerning. And remember that Switzerland is an ultra developed country, and even they found it very concerning what happened in that small village. But over to you, Hassan.
Yeah, that's all quite profound stuff, and sounds like your mandate is quite important. And I really want to talk to you about that. And I was just thinking about the last episode that we did in July last year, and we talked about like Islamic finance and its principles and its origins, and we've done that with other guests as well, including Dr. Ryan Calder, Dr. Muhammad Akram Laladin, who was in our last episode, as well as other guests as well. But with you, Reza, one of the things I found interesting is that we talked a lot about how Islamic finance hasn't really translated into like economic development for people in predominantly Muslim countries and indeed across the world. I mean, do you have any high-level thoughts on, has that changed since our last episode, do you think?
Well, one thing which occurred to me was that the hundreds of billions that the Muslim world is going to allocate to artificial intelligence, I think the Muslim world would be better off putting at least a portion of that money, a few tens of billions, towards climate change. That would reap immediate benefits and dividends. Now, one insight, most people don't think about it, but when you look at the Syrian conflict, which is most unfortunate, and let me say from the outset, my heart weeps for all the innocent people that have been adversely affected by this. But you should know that before the troubles in Syria, for 2 years, there was a very long drought, which forced a lot of people from the countryside into the cities. And when they had left in the countryside what was essentially a very, very quiet and dignified and secure life, to become ultimately economic climate refugees in the cities, living essentially in the slums. And when the trouble started, they were the first one to take up arms. Fast forward, what do we see is that a beautiful country like Syria is now a land of ruins. Most of its population has left, and the rule of law has collapsed altogether. And obviously, Western media present it as a fight against dictatorship, etc. I have come at an age, Hassan, where I see what people do, not what people say. And what I see is that the vast majority of normal Syrian people are far worse off. And obviously, there was political disagreements. But what I'm seeing is that a lot of Syrians have had to leave their homeland and look for better future elsewhere. And that is the loss of Syria. And what keeps me awake at night is that this could happen in a lot of other countries. So indeed, if there's a jihad to be done, it's a jihad against desertification. It's a jihad to ensure that our children inherit a livable earth. So coming back to our point, yes, indeed, there's a lot of money going into AI, but I don't believe in AI. If you pardon my pun, I believe in IA. I believe in Allah. I don't believe in artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is Google search on steroids. That's what it is. It will churn out what you have fed it. I'm not telling you that it's not an amazing technology. I think that there's stuff which is extraordinary. But artificial intelligence should not make humankind stupid. And I think that this is what is actually happening. I think that there's extraordinary applications, including in space with AI, but ultimately people have got to realize we live in a very, very tangible world. We can invest billions, hundreds of billions in AI, but that is not a substitute for having clean air, clean water, and decent food, and access to the right kind of public health at a decent price.
This, I agree with you on Syria. Like the uprisings there were prompted initially by climate considerations, although some people may disagree. And then the whole political stuff. We had an episode with a really good Syrian economist, Jihad Yazigi. I'll link it in the show notes. And we spent like a good hour and a half talking about the context of the Syrian economy and uprising. But this idea of AI, I was in the UAE a few weeks ago. And Donald Trump was also visiting the Gulf countries. I think he went to Saudi, Qatar, and UAE, and they signed billions of dollars of agreements in AI. And there's a lot of news about the UAE, for example, giving AI to a lot of its citizens and residents, and Saudi's trying to get in on that as well as Qatar. So a lot of these Gulf countries. But like in tandem with that, Reza, one thing I noticed when I was in the UAE is that there's really extreme heat. Like I was there at the beginning of May, and usually it gets to the high 30s, low 40s. But when I was there, it was already like 46. 47. And another thing I noticed as well, particularly in Dubai, was the air quality wasn't that great. So this idea, like it's just specifically to the less economically developed Muslim countries. It's not just for them, right? It's for the entire Muslim world.
It's for the entire world, period. It's not simply, but the Muslim world is on the front line. And unfortunately, for instance, in India, in Pakistan, you've had instances where people just walking in the street, dying on the spot because of heat. That is very, very concerning. We've got to put our energies to make sure that the earth doesn't become uninhabitable. And indeed, there is this heat problem. And also there's this desertification problem. And the fact that the earth is becoming arid. There's the acidification of the oceans. And there's a huge issue regarding being able to produce enough food for humanity. Because in many ways, the world's population is exploding. And in order to maintain that social peace on a global level, we need to ensure that everyone gets enough dignified food to eat every day at an acceptable price.
One of the things I wanted to ask you was during my time in the UAE, it seemed like climate is not as, excuse the pun, as not as hot topic as it was, say, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Obviously, with Donald Trump being in the White House, that climate and ESG have been like not as prioritized as before. And, with all the other geopolitics going on and the Chinese angle as well, it seems to me, although in the UAE they do mention about climate change and net zero and stuff, why has there been this mismatch between, say, Islamic financial institutions and like climate? Do you think they're doing enough? Like if you look at the Islamic Development Bank, for example, they just in Algeria in their conference last week or week before, they launched their 10-year plan and they mentioned about climate, but they don't really offer like real tangible solutions. I'm not saying like a lot of these guys aren't doing anything. Like if you go to Abu Dhabi, for example, one of the largest solar panel farms is based in the world is based there. But what I'm saying is like a lot of these rich countries or more wealthy Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries, I should rather say, have the resources and they seem to have good ideas in abstract, but in terms of actually deploying that capital to tangible, measurable projects that have an real impact on people, it seems to be taking a lot of time.
It's taking a concerning amount of time. But let's start with a couple of insights. The issue with a lot of financial institutions worldwide is that they follow whatever is the latest buzzword. And then it became blockchain, and now we're talking AI. So most financial institutions are there to make a profit. So they will follow whatever the trend or the latest fashion is. But we've got to look at the realities. And the reality is we live in a very, very tangible world. And if we don't have a good environment, we all suffer. So indeed, the issue was that, especially for instance, the COP was organized in Muslim countries. When there was a buzz around everything to do with ESG and climate, everyone was flocking towards this. But to be honest with you, a lot of these gatherings were talking shops, and nothing much came out of it. I think what is very important to realize is that very often you can achieve more with a grassroots, scalable project than with a large, what I would describe as white elephant project. And unfortunately in the Muslim world, and I'm not pointing to any specific geography, but in the Muslim world, there is a cult of the white elephant. And we need to go back to the idea of the mighty micro. It's better to have swarms which are resilient, or small projects, all going towards a common positive good, and which have resilience as a swarm, as opposed to trying to do the one mega project that will be Deus ex machina. Extremely rare that one mighty project will be a panacea. What you want to do is to nurture and foster the small projects and try to scale them up. And what I've seen is that there is the rhetoric, there is the implementation, and there's the transplantation. Let me give you one insight. There's the whole idea of microcredits, micro-lending. Officially started out in Bangladesh with Grameen Bank, with Muhammad Yunus. But whenever they talk about microcredit, micro-lending, and Western institutions very often forget about the extraordinary work by BRAC, which was also a contemporary of micro-lending, was good in certain circumstances and terribly wrong in others. And when this model was brought in to other countries, especially other poor countries, as a panacea, there was a lot of what I describe as social accidents. Because what happens in microlending is that essentially you leverage your social capital to obtain financial capital. And you're trying to start a micro enterprise that you're hoping to scale up. Sometimes it worked totally fine, but many times it collapsed, because that's the nature of entrepreneurship. And unfortunately, the people who had raised money through microlending whose enterprises had collapsed, they became social pariah, because you have got essentially, there's other people who stand shorty for you in microlending. So essentially, the situation is complex, but the reality is as follows. Especially in everything to do with climate adaptation, climate mitigation, there's a lot of measures that you can do at a ground level. These are very often what I describe as, for lack of a better term, not low technology, but resilient technology that you can implement sort of at a macro level. And these, unfortunately, are not necessarily considered. And very often we tend to overemphasize and over-prioritize high-tech solutions coming from elsewhere. Very often in a lot of poor countries, you have people who are extremely resilient, extremely inventive, and who have been able to, using an Indian word, use the term jagad, which is basically invention under very, very limited resources in very, very urgent situations, making more out of very less. And I'd like to also explain the word jagad, because jagad also has got a very pejorative vision. Some people say that it's really being cheap. So I'll give you an example, living example of elegant jagad. So in pre-independence Mauritius, there was a lady, she was pregnant, and before she completed her 6 months pregnancy, she gave birth. She gave birth to a little girl, and that little girl was so small that she could fit in a shoebox. And what happened is that the little girl would not take the mother's milk, and to complicate matters further, there was no incubator in Mauritius at that time. So everyone around thought that this little girl was doomed. There was a gentleman, a medical doctor from the civil service. He saw the situation, and what he did was as follows. He literally took a shoebox, and with the available materials, he crafted an incubator. And given that the baby would not take the mother's milk, he crafted a formula out of baby powder, out of available food, to feed the baby. He would come several times a day to feed the baby, and they used the incubator. The baby survived and became a normal person. The baby didn't have any what the French call séquelles. The baby was not handicapped, was a normal baby, and I'm told that she's even became a fairly portly woman. Now, I know the story, firstly because there's a British Medical Journal article on it. I'm happy to give you the PDF afterwards.
We'll link in the show notes.
And also, the gentleman, the medical doctor, was my maternal grandfather, Dr. Hassan Fakim. So this just shows that with the right person at the right situation, you can do miracles. Which brings me back to Elekan Jagat in the context of climate adaptation, climate mitigation. I think that there's a lot of solutions out there which are relatively simple, but where there's a lot of thought behind, which can be implemented and can be implemented in a resource optimal manner and at scale.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, we talked a lot last time about the Islamic Development Bank and some of these other Islamic financial institutions they've tried to do instruments where they integrate Islamic finance and climate finance, and for the idea of trying to address climate issues and other issues. And it just brings me back to a story. I don't know if I said it on the last podcast, but when the Islamic Development Bank, or it was the World Bank, that issued the Sukuk, the IFM Sukuk in 2014, which was a really great deal. Like I don't think we've ever seen something since then as innovative as that, and which had a real world impact on a community. But one of the things I wanted to mention to you, Reza, is that I remember when I wrote that story in 2014, I think it was, I remember talking to an investor, Sukuk investor, who worked for a fairly large Sukuk institution, Islamic financial institution, and he was really excited about this deal. Usually, when the primary market comes and opens, people place their orders, the institutions place their orders. So he placed his order for the Sukuk, he had it on his books, and it was delivering a fantastic return for his portfolio. It did real world stuff, like in terms of community impact. It was very like as halal as you can get. Everyone was very happy. But then like about a week later, I met him for coffee, and then he said to me, I got a call from my management saying to drop this Sukuk immediately. Now when his boss basically told him to sell this Sukuk off the portfolio, that he asked why, and basically the boss from the senior management was being told, "Oh, we're not a charity. This is charitable." And it just kind of stuck with me. It's been sticking with me for the last decade, in that this was a commercially structured deal which delivered a good return for the investor and the portfolio, had a real world impact, was from a reputable institution like the World Bank. It was certified halal by a bunch of some of the best scholars, Islamic finance scholars in the world, and yet the investor, the top investor who makes all the decisions and the committees and everything, he didn't believe in any of this. And incidentally, he was actually a Muslim, this guy. My question to you is do you think Islamic financial institutions, and by extension investors, do you think they really understand these risks and issues, or do you think they're just following the trend as always?
I think we should look at impact investing. So impact investing, which for a while was a buzzword, which is very interesting in that impact investing really started out to cater to the demand from ultra high net worth individuals who were not simply happy to do conventional charity. On the one hand, they wanted to do well by doing good, certainly, but they also believed that they could solve social issues through the use of the market, through the use of the financial market. And indeed, impact investing, I think, is very interesting for the Islamic world because of the relationship between the capital provider and entrepreneurs, which very often are social entrepreneurs, and also what the capital providers are looking for in terms of returns. I think the Islamic finance world can learn a lot from impact investing in terms of we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And secondly, there's a lot of issues that we can avoid by learning from the mistakes of impact investing.
I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but one of the things when you say that, as soon as you say impact investing in the Islamic or Islamic world, the first thing that comes to my mind is Abraj. So yeah,
which ended up very, very badly, unfortunately.
Yeah, and Arif Naqvi was pushing a lot of impact investing and championing that.
And it's a very, very fair point. And Abraj is a major case in point. It had its specificities because Abraj also there's a political facet to it. And again, I'm not a supporter of a gentleman, I'm not a detractor, I just look at what happened. I think that what Abraj was doing was very interesting in terms of what they were looking to address. It had a number of major financial backers, especially Western financial backers. And it was also operating in a very complicated geopolitical context. So it's difficult to come out with generalization from Abraj. But I think that what one needs to keep in mind is that obviously impact investing is about doing well through doing good. But also it's a buzzword, and there's a lot of people who flocked to the buzzword of impact investing, and overnight they were no longer simply private equity people, they were impact investors. Just like there were a lot of usurers who suddenly became micro-lenders, ethical micro-lenders. So there's a lot of, not even greenwashing, but there's a lot of chameleons out there. And the devil is in the details. You've got to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah, I think the phrase is faith washing.
Yes, faith washing is good. I mean, you have the whole idea of greenwashing, but also you have got a lot of people who are very unscrupulous and who will use the name of our Lord with disregard. So, but the bottom line is that you have to look at what the humans need. Case of Abraj, okay, electrification in Pakistan, that makes a lot of sense. But as I said, in a very complicated geopolitical context, but there was certainly a need. And so these cases are complex. I tend to think that I prefer initiatives that are homegrown and that you scale up over time. Essentially, then if you fail fast, and there's a certain degree of resilience. Large infrastructure projects in emerging markets are complicated, always, because there's always a political angle, and also very often governments deal with quote-unquote legacy issues. Essentially what the previous regime, which very often got kicked out for corruption, for governance issues, left. As a new government, as a new administration, you have a legacy, a baggage of contracts, decisions taken. Some are good, some less good, but it's not clear-cut. What remains certain is that ultimately what emerging markets need first and foremost is good governance. And the more I grow older, the more I become certain that what is necessary in a lot of emerging countries is what I describe as good administration and, for lack of a better term, enlightened despotism. A personal hero of mine is Lee Kuan Yew.
Singapore, yeah.
Now, I agree that for a lot of people, including Singaporeans, they criticize what Lee Kuan Yew did. But what I find remarkable, especially as someone who has grown up in a country that has had numerous governance issues, is the fact that he's transformed essentially a country which was without resources except manpower into one of the world's premier economies. And I'll give you another insight. So Singapore and Malaysia used to be part of the Malaysian Federation until Singapore got kicked out. And then Singapore had to go it alone. I would tend to think that medium to long term, Singapore and Malaysia should work together. I mean, that is not for me to advocate, but geographically, they make a lot of sense. And also, there's a lot that Singapore and Singaporeans can contribute to Malaysia and vice versa. And I hope that within my lifetime or earlier, we see this happening. And I think that it would be great for Southeast Asia, it would be great for both countries, and ultimately it would be great for the world. So I'll give you another insight, Hassan. So my middle name is Zain. So my middle name, I'm named after one of the best friends of my late father. My father studied medicine in Glasgow. While he was in Glasgow, he had the privilege of meeting a number of students from Malaysia. They became very good friends with my father. And one of the best friends of my father was named Zain. And this is why I have this middle name. And I went with my father, my mum, and my brother to Malaysia in the early 1990s, which was the heyday of Malaysia. Because I remember that at the time, there was a boom in Malaysia, not simply from a financial point of view, but from a soft power, from a cultural diplomacy point of view. The whole of the world wanted to open embassies in Malaysia, and it was viewed as the modern Islam. It was tolerant, it was welcoming, it was sophisticated, and it was looking extremely promising. Now, a lot of things have happened since. I think that paradoxically, right now, Malaysia is again at a crossroads, and potentially there is this rare opportunity in destiny whereby Malaysia could take off again. I think there's, especially with the 1MDB affair, what people have realized is that there is a certain degree of governance and decency amongst the Malaysians, and you have seen it in the result of elections. Right now, Malaysia is at crossroads, but as I said, under the right circumstances, their future is bright.
Yeah, I agree. I think Anwar Ibrahim's doing a fantastic job, and he himself has got a really fascinating story. And from what I've been reading in articles and talking to Malaysian friends is that the economy now seems to be doing better, although there's a bit of an issue between, are they more China aligned or are they more with the US? And, Malaysia's done very well in, locating things like data centers, semiconductors, in addition to financial services and other industries. So they've done a really fantastic job in getting themselves back on footing after the 1MDB scandal. But Reza, one of the things I wanted to ask you was that, you mentioned about Singapore and about this idea that sometimes it's better to have one leader. So, if you look at the Gulf countries, they're not exactly Jeffersonian democracies. But, one of the things about Dubai, for example, or the UAE or Saudi Arabia is that not now, but because the oil prices are a bit lower, but like for the last 5 years or 6 years, seem to be doing a lot with the oil windfall, and they can make decisions very quickly. My question is why are Islamic financial institutions in the GCC not doing enough in recognizing these challenges?
You mean climate challenges amongst others?
Climate, and most people, if you talk to them, are only interested in, if this company is issuing a green bond or a green Sukuk or a sustainable bond or a sustainable Sukuk, and what's the pricing dynamics. They're not really looking at the details of the project. Do you think some momentum's been lost from that?
If I may, I have to start with a couple of... If you look at the GCC essentially, you have got a number of countries. And in all these countries, you have got essentially a pyramidal structure, most of them. It's not a criticism. It is a fact. And this dictates a lot of the economic life as well. But what I see is that ultimately for all these sovereign wealth funds, all these family offices, I don't think that they're the ones who necessarily are going to create something from scratch. And again, it's not a criticism because they're in capital allocation. So what is super important is that you have the entrepreneurs coming up with a solution whereby, okay, I have an opportunity to bring in capital to the right technologies addressing climate urgencies. This is what I'm going to return to you. That's my projected return. This is how I'm ensuring that there's no downside risk. And this is how I'm going to scale up. So there needs to be a pitch towards that money. And what is super important is that the returns of such financial instruments, funds, however you want to call them, that the returns must be market rate, at least. There needs also to be a halal angle, because halal is important. And the combination of a market rate plus halal beats anything that is conventional. Now, again, because I like to think that if you address a real problem in a scalable manner, ultimately you're going to get super returns. Now, again, you will tell me why, okay, you're mentioning this, but Reza, what are you doing concretely? The largest project of No Hunger for the last few years has been to create indeed that alliance of willing investors to address the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in a way that is profitable for the investors. You attract the investors by ensuring that it's profitable to them. Some people say, for instance, impact investing is charity or this. No. Impact investing needs to be profitable. You can go outside the box. In fact, you need to go outside the box. The investor needs to get at least a market rate return.
Can you define what do you mean by market rate return?
I think that you should look at what conventional returns are. But the other question is, how do you structure? You structure it as a fund, you structure it as bonds, you structure it as Sukuk. Now we're talking about Islamic finance, we'll talk about Sukuk. What No Hunger has been working on is about connecting the ultra liquidity of the Sukuk market to climate emergencies. Why? Because we, the Muslim world, we've got the youngest demographic. So our children and our grandchildren will be the front line of the climate crisis. We've got to address this in order to save money. A good English proverb says, "Stitch in time saves nine." So the idea is to invest in this, to get an adequate return, but to save a lot of money. And I would say that the return that we should look at is essentially a return of what I would say, it's not simply a conventional investment. It's ultimately about defense. Because if you have got this projected amount of climate refugees, no longer, and against, excuse my cynicism, it's no longer a humanitarian issue. It is a defense issue. And personally, what our endeavor is to enable people to stay in the countryside and to have dignified lives with good earnings and not to become climate refugees. I endeavor to keep our cities livable. And the Muslim world, paradoxically, has got money. Because the Muslim world is unleveraged. The US is printing a lot of. China has got a lot of debts. Germany could take on debt. But the Islamic world is unleveraged. And that is the biggest strength of the Islamic world. We can fund the fight against climate change.
One thing I wanted to ask you just on this idea of Sukuk, a lot of people are worried about this new AOFI Sharia Standard 62, which is basically, and I've spoken to lots of people about this, making Sukuk arguably more what Sukuk are supposed to be, which are profit and loss and risk-sharing instruments, not just unsecured lending. From what you're saying, like a lot of Islamic finance, you and I both know that Islamic finance technically is supposed to be different to the conventional finance, but for various reasons and market conditions, most Islamic products, and I've talked to Dr. Ryan Calder about this, who's written a book about it, 90% of Islamic finance, the way it's practiced today, mirrors the conventional for various reasons, historical and market and this thing. But what are your thoughts on things like AOFI Sharia Standard 62 in that it could completely change the Sukuk market? Would you, as someone who's looking to structure a Sukuk or issue a Sukuk, would you be willing to, like, I don't know, share your profit with an investor if it does go up?
I think that investors should, well, there's always this idea of risk return, but investors ultimately, especially in the idea of profit and loss sharing, should share in the upside. But there's, strictly speaking, profit and loss sharing. So there's a downside risk. So ultimately, it's a question of structuring and also a question of how do you being transparent about the product. In that, are you looking to offer less return but with far lower risk? Or are you looking to have more of a venture capital approach whereby, okay, you could lose the whole of your capital? So when I'm looking at the history of Islamic finance, and what we should talk about is modern Islamic finance, because Islamic finance, in fact, reemerges in the 70s.
You're talking about Islamic banking.
Islamic banking and finance in the sense that you have, it re-emerges in the 70s when the Muslim world becomes affluent again. So indeed, we've got halal alternatives which are created. When the era then, and again, this is a hindsight vision is 2020, was to try to tinker with conventional financial structures to make them halal or Sharia compliant. I think that was a mistake. Again, I can't criticize. What is done is done. But I think that ultimately there's two things. The Muslim world wants to be able to make payments and save and invest. So instead of simply what you should have had are Islamic payment institutions, which could have been trustees of money, but then calling them banks would have been an issue in the sense that I think that what you have, because I always refer to what our religion advocates regarding how we should use our material wealth. So there was an opportunity to do more, create more investment funds, investment trusts, as opposed to banks. And what you should have had would have been indeed those investment trusts. And on the other side, you would have had essentially payment and custodianship institutions, which essentially should have charged a fee for their services, but offered no interest whatsoever. So I think we should have separated them. Trying to mix them together in a conventional financial environment was something where potentially we went astray. But again, hindsight vision is 2020. But the question is how, going forward, we can learn from our errors.
But Reza, one of the things is that, like I mentioned this to Ryan, is that decoupling from the international financial system, like for example, Pakistan or Iran or Sudan historically, and Libya and other countries, say they want an Islamic financial system, but at the end of the day, you're still connected to the riba, US-led, for now, IMF-led system, which is based on fiat currency. It's primarily based on riba. Yes, IMF institution can have Islamic finance departments, but it's simulating interest. It's not actually doing what we're talking about, real profit loss sharing. Like you as a Modari putting money in, and if the project goes wrong, you could lose money. Like working within that parameter, I don't know how that's possible for some countries.
Let me bring in a couple of elements. Ultimately, what Islamic finance, what Islam advocates, is entrepreneurial, profit and loss sharing, real economy, ethical impact finance. And that paradoxically is what a lot of people in Western countries also endeavor towards. Because what you need to understand is that you've got debt money and you have money which ultimately is backed by real assets. The issue with the world, which also brings in the whole climate element, is that we've got a financial economy that has ballooned out of all proportion. We have got resources which are staying the same or which are depleting, and you have less and less money being allocated by conventional finance towards the real economy. That is the ultimate problem. And so it is totally possible to have financial instruments which are halal, which happen to be halal, and which also satisfy the aspiration of a lot of Western consumers, investors. Essentially, what I'll use one metaphor. If let's say we go to a restaurant, it's a halal restaurant, and the food is also sourced ethically. And for instance, the people working in the restaurant are previous offenders, criminals, to whom there has been given a new opportunity. So here, everyone's happy. Again, I think that there's a number of financial instruments which could be constructed, which would be what I would describe as an ikigai, to use the Japanese term, between a number of financial consumers. And I think that what is very important is to no longer present halal or even sharia as simply something excluding entities, but more as a filter. Whatever goes through the filter of halal goes through the filter of sharia, which tend towards more of a substance than anything else, is typically a resilient product. So it should be seen more as a test, as opposed to saying, oh, this is only for the Islamic community. No. I think that when you look at a product, it needs to be a resilient financial product. And indeed, when you invest or when you consume, you have got an impact on the economy, you have got an impact also on climate. And in this way, this idea of responsibility echoes what a lot of ethical consumers are looking at in the West.
Just changing gear for a second, I wanted to talk to you also today about Islamic finance in Europe. You know, we've been talking for the last hour nearly about Islamic finance and what's wrong with it. But, you know, there have been experiments done in various jurisdictions, including in Europe. You know, 2014 for me on a personal level was a really interesting year. All these countries issuing Sukuk for the first time. I had the opportunity to interview some people from the government of Luxembourg, and I know you were aware of what was going on at the time. And it was, although in the financial media was painting it as a very successful transaction, I can attest from an anecdotal experience that a lot of people were not happy with that. Can you share any insights on Islamic finance or the experiment of Islamic finance in Europe?
Well, given that we are talking about Luxembourg, one thing that we've got to talk about is Bank, European Islamic Bank, which again dates back from 2013. Again, here I've got to put in a number of caveats because a lot of what I've been told is true. Different people have said different things to me, but I will tell you what is factual. What is factual was that there were two entrepreneurs coming from the Islamic world. A gentleman named Amar Dabour, who is of Palestinian origin, and a gentleman named Anwar Hassoun, who is of Moroccan origin. I've had the pleasure to meet both of them. Amar was very much the business developer, and Anwar Hassoun was a technical person. And I can say that technically, as a financial person, he is quite superb. And we could do a whole podcast about it. But suffice to say that it ended in tears. There's various versions that I've heard from various people. And what I also know is that a lot of people in various positions of responsibility were not happy with the general outcome. And I think that the fact that at one point it collapsed like a house of cards, it basically polluted the well. It put a lot of questions on the future of Islamic finance. One thing which is very disquieting to me is, for instance, the Sukuk in Luxembourg. When they did it, they raised all the money that they needed at an excellent coupon. But then they did not extend. I'd be very, very curious to know the real story. And also, I'd be curious to know who were the actual day in, day out advisors. Because I thought, okay, they raised a lot of money at very good terms. It's a success. So why don't you persevere? And that's very unfortunate. Especially, in the current context. I'm in mainland Europe. And what's happening in mainland Europe, factually, is very, very disquieting. People getting stabbed in mosques, people getting gunned down, extremists taking videos before their atrocious acts and after, posting online. It's disquieting. And what is more and more disquieting is the fact that the authorities don't seem to react or to do anything about it. There's a number, and it's factual. There's a number of channels in France which day in, day out keeps spewing lies and propaganda regarding the Muslim community. Powers that be don't seem to react. It's very, very disquieting because it also infringes a number of fundamental rights that you have as a European citizen. But generally, I think that what's happening is that there's a lot of people with loudspeakers who are saying a lot of things which are completely false. And that is creating a very, very, very dangerous environment in that if you look at the beginning of the First and the Second World Wars, we are not in such a different situations. And what is happening is that there's a lot of people who, for various reasons, decide not to intervene, whereas it would be prerogative to do something about it.
With the Sukuk, just on the Luxembourg Sukuk, I can share a little bit of color, is that I remember interviewing somebody from the Ministry of Finance, and the gentleman basically said to me once the Sukuk was issued, exactly to what you said, it was a fantastic deal. It was a small deal, 200 million euros. It wasn't a massive transaction size, but the pricing was pari passu or even lower than conventional Luxembourg bonds.
Deal in terms of coupon.
Yeah, the coupon was very low. But what was interesting, what he said straight after me was I'm never doing this again. He said, I don't want to ever be part of a Sukuk transaction ever again. And I said to him, why? And he said, the advisors who were advising us just, it was an unenjoyable experience, he said. So it'd be interesting to know who the advisors were on that transaction and talk to them about it. But, Luxembourg to me is an interesting place, is that a lot of it's interesting when you talk about Islamic finance in Luxembourg, because a lot of Islamic funds, especially from the big ones, are actually domiciled in Luxembourg. Absolutely. And you get a lot of American firms which have Sharia compliant mandates and that want to attract European investors or international investors outside the US are domiciled in Luxembourg, but they just do this very quietly.
Exactly.
Yeah, now Luxembourg is an interesting place. I mean, you spend a lot of your time there, right?
I'm spending a lot of my time there, and I mean, probably that could be the subject of a podcast, but there's going to be a lot in the media regarding me being there. And I can say essentially that there will be sparks
Yeah,
in that.
if you do you have anything to share, or not really on this platform?
I think that given that we've spoken for more than an hour, I'm happy to talk at length regarding this specific podcast because I have to give all the background. But let me just say one thing. So I've said earlier about everything that is happening in Europe regarding a lot of administrative powers looking at Muslims in a very, very negative manner. I, for one, in a very specific case, I'm going to take a stand. And it's going to be, well, I think that the outcome will be interesting for the whole world. And you'll have a ringside seat to it, which echoes what I was thinking of Muhammad Ali. You know, Muhammad Ali, for me, he was the greatest. The GOAT.
The boxer we're talking about, right?
The
The boxer.
boxer. I mean, obviously, Malcolm X, he left us far too early. But a lot of why we'll still be talking about Muhammad Ali 200 years from now is that he was first and foremost a civil rights champion. He was a champion in the ring, but he was willing to risk it all outside of the ring to defend certain civil liberties. And that's how he was a wordsmith as well. But that's how he will be remembered. And what happens is that, I mean, for a lot of people, financially and otherwise, it's not worth taking a stand. But one will take a stand when one realizes that it's your deen. I mean, there's a reason why Creator has put this in your life. Essentially, you have a certain amount of capacities, and you're going to engage with the problem. You might lose, but you're going to engage with it. So, I mean, obviously, as Muslims, we believe in destiny. We believe that whatever hardship is put on our way, it's the Lord who's testing us. So, essentially, for one, as I said, I'm going to do something about institutional Islamophobia in Europe in a grand.
Watch this space.
Watch this.
Reza, tell us any projects you may be working on or upcoming projects you may be working on.
Okay, main project, leveraging money from the Islamic world, especially qualified money, to connect to the best-in-class climate solutions. That's the main project. Second project, doing a lot more with Mauritius and enabling Mauritius to become prosperous again. Because unfortunately, I mean, on the 11th of November of last year, there was an electoral tsunami in Mauritius, following what was a number of scandals. And I am my parents, my loved ones live in Mauritius, and I'm very, very concerned about the financial situation in Mauritius. But I say so plainly, they can be fixed. If you think outside the box, and I've been working on this for a number of months now, I'll go back and I'll fix it. Because essentially, all right, as I said, I mean, Hassan, there's a lot of rhetoric in the Islamic world, but I think that there's the doers and there's the talkers. I aim to be a doer. I will fail, probably, but I will try. And there's a question of talking the talk and walking the walk. I will walk the walk.
Inshallah. Reza, what's the best way for people to reach you? Have your contact details or social media changed since we last spoke?
Well, it's still the same. I've got a very large network on LinkedIn. They can find me on Reza Zain Jaufeerally. But my address is simple, rjaufeerally@gmail.com. I also have got a X Twitter page, but I'm easily reachable.
I'll leave it in the show notes so people can reach you. But Reza Jaufeerally, this has been a really fantastic conversation for part 2. We've got to definitely get a part 3 before the end of this year, inshallah. I can't believe it's already June. But yeah, no, it's really fantastic to catch up with you once again and to chat to you about all these things. Yeah, once again, my du'as and prayers are with you and your family. And yeah, no, I wish you all the best on all your endeavors, inshallah.
I mean, I just want to add one little insight. My dad was a medical doctor for most of his life. On my mother's side, it's been medical doctors for 3 generations. And medicine is something quite special to the Islamic world. At one point, the Islamic world was producing the best doctors worldwide. I think the Islamic world has got it within itself to aim for greatness and achieve greatness again by focusing on what is important. That's about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Reza.
Thank you.